The gospel from today is from Luke 7, verses 1 to 10, found in the New Testament portion of your Pew Bibles on page 65. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly and was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal this slave. When they came to Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come. They appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you to do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you. But only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. For I am also a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. May God help us to understand these scriptures. O God, may the peace of our hearts and the meditations of our minds be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. The title of today's sermon is called "The Faith of an Outsider." In both 1 Kings and in Luke, you'll notice they were talking about foreigners. Now, you'd say, well, a centurion, is he a foreigner? Centurions were Roman. Romans were Gentiles. And Gentiles, according to Jewish tradition and law, were sinners. So this was a man who was considered by the Jewish people a sinner. He had not yet chosen the Jewish faith. So he has this sick slave whom he's very concerned about it. I'm sure you've all been concerned about people in your lives. We just did our intercessory prayer. So what he did was he sent emissaries. First, he sent the Jewish elders who had known him to be a man of good integrity and a hard worker, and that in some ways he had good relationships with the Jewish people and had actually helped build the temple. He sent them because he was a Gentile, because he was a sinner. And he did not believe that he could approach Jesus. They said, "He is worthy." How often do you and me, how often do we make judgments about who's worthy of God's blessing and who isn't? There's a wonderful phrase that is common in the Christian language. "There but for the grace of God go I." How many people have heard that? I have a problem with that. Because inherent in that statement, "There but for the grace of God go I," is the assumption that it doesn't go with the other person. I have God's grace. They don't. And so there, but for the grace of God, which I claim, they live in poverty, they're homeless, they're mentally ill, they've got crippling illnesses, they're addicted to drugs and alcohol. Inherent in that statement is superiority. So I ask you again, how often do you judge others? How do you judge others? What standards do you use? Are they churchgoers? Do they believe what I do? What other kind of indicators might, when you're looking at somebody, even if you don't know them, might make you wonder and might make you judge? Question. What make you my judge? What if someone stinks? Might that make you judge? Now, if you're seeing them out working, okay, and you know that they're doing stuff, that makes, but if you see them as you're walking in Shaw's, and they have a huge body out, might you start to judge them? Stay away from them. What if they had different language? What if they were a foreigner? What if they didn't have the education that you had? What if they weren't as bright? What if they didn't dress properly? We put a huge value in these United States of ours on beauty. What if they're not quite as pretty as we want them to be? Or they don't have the right haircut? Or they don't hold themselves in the right way? Or they kind of seem like, oh, I better watch out for that. I don't know what's going on. Now, some of that is valid, and we need to pay attention to those instincts. But I bet when I first asked the questions, you said, well, I probably don't judge that many people. Have you thought of people that you might have judged in your life? Are they able-bodied? Are they in wheelchairs? Do they look like they're hearing voices? Do they have amputations? What about other people causes you to judge them? For everyone here, you have to ask that question. Because the text today, both the Old Testament and the New, are regarding foreigners. And foreigners, I will define here for this purpose as being anyone different from you, that you would just judge based on that difference. How about people in different socioeconomic classes? Do you usually hang around with people who have about as much money as you do? I had a course that I taught at the University of Rhode Island, and one of the books that I would recommend to everyone here, and I had every class read, was Amazing Grace by Jonathan Kozol. It's about the South Bronx and the poorest of the poor. And it's both depressing as a book, but it's hopeful in that you see these children's spirit. But what it does is it challenges our notion about ourselves. Because think about it. What if you had the person who could cure cancer in that ghetto? They got shot. They didn't have adequate nutrition. They didn't have adequate supervision. They didn't have adequate health care. What might happen to that person? We are a privileged group. We are a privileged group. I don't know how many of you have grown up poor or from difficult families. But what about those who don't? What about those people that haven't had the opportunities, whose brains simply were not fed proper nutrition or proper prenatal nutrition? How do you judge them? And I guess I ask you, can you say, there but for the grace of God go I? Because if you read Jonathan Kozol's book, you will see God's grace with these people in the midst of having horrible, horrible circumstances in which they grow up. God's grace is with them. How do you judge foreigners? So first, this centurion sends the Jewish elders to approach God and say, he is worthy. And then what does he do? Jesus is getting closer. But he doesn't want him to come to his home. How many people have had that feeling? That you don't measure up. He did not feel worthy, and that's what his friends told Jesus. I am not worthy for you to come here to me. How many of you feel unworthy? And what is it specifically that you need to write down on that piece of paper that hinders you from either accepting God's forgiveness and claiming it as your own, or being able to be God's servant in this world, to become the person God created? But this centurion had faith enough to know that Jesus could heal with a word. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? We give no one that power now, do we? We give no one that power. Probably because we are in the United States. And we have this idea that we can all pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we are a government that has three different parties to it, three different branches to it. We are not in a dictatorship where you can go to the leader and say, okay, you make it right. Can't happen. We're a people that works together. So part of our, I think even our culture and our government and who we are does not give that much power to anyone. We in the United Church of Christ certainly don't give it all to the pastor. We're not, probably the only one I can think we might give that much power to is the Pope in religious aspects. We may give some power to the pastor, but I certainly stand here and know you can fire me whenever you want. That's part of the local church ethics. That's part of our ethics as a church. So who do you give power to? This centurion gave the power to Jesus and said, I know you can heal my slave with a word. And he was healed. Jesus died for each person here. Not for some mythical person out there or some faraway generation. Jesus died so that you could live. Can you claim that forgiveness? Can you go forth from this place bringing your burdens to God, or the major burden in your life, and leaving it on this altar? Today we are going to say, as we give out both the bread and the cup, the bread of life and the cup of blessing. That blessing is forgiveness. That blessing is God's grace. That blessing is not one of us here is worthy. Not one of us. But in Jesus' death, we are all worthy. We are all freed if we choose to claim it, if we choose to understand it in our hearts, in our minds, and in our spirit. We can live as freed people. We have God's grace, just as all those out there on the road do. Those in the South Bronx do. Those who look different from us, act different from us. We have God's grace. It's whether we choose to accept it and look to it. It may not change our circumstances. God's grace may not take that child out of poverty. That grace may not keep that person safe. That grace may not keep someone from getting into an accident or having a drive-by shooting. But God's grace can strengthen you for whatever lies ahead. God's grace can heal you in ways that you can't even imagine. God's grace is freely given at this table. Bring your burden, or bring one of your burdens, just one. Maybe the hardest to give up, and maybe the easiest to give up. But place it in that basket and give it to God. Leave knowing that God will work with you on that burden. That God can heal with a word. You may not hear the word. You very well may. But you can be healed, and you are forgiven. And you have God's grace, whether privileged or underprivileged, whether oppressed or free, whether powerful or powerless. You have God's forgiveness in Jesus. Amen. Let us pass the peace between one another, saying, "The peace of God be with you and also with you."